room was full of people I barely knew, and every single one of them heard what he said about me. I remember the champagne flute in his hand catching the light from the chandeliers above, that particular gold shimmer that you only see in rooms that cost more than my annual pension. He was already mid-sentence when I turned around, and the words landed like something physical, like a door slamming in a house you've lived in your whole life. I'll come back to that moment. But first, you need to understand who I was before I walked into that ballroom. My name is Elspeth. I'm 63 years old, and I spent the better part of 4 decades working as a records clerk for the Provincial Health Authority in New Brunswick. Not glamorous work, not the kind of job that gets mentioned at dinner parties. But it was steady, it paid into my pension, and it taught me something that would matter much later. Records never lie. People lie. Documents don't. I raised my daughter Miriam alone from the time she was 4 years old. Her father, my ex-husband, left in November of 1992. He didn't leave for another woman, or at least not right away. He left because he said he felt suffocated. That was the word he used. Standing in our kitchen in Fredericton with a duffel bag over his shoulder. Suffocated by a woman who worked full-time, kept the house, cooked dinner, and had just put our daughter to bed after she'd had an ear infection for the 3rd time that winter. He moved to Alberta within the year, sent child support for about 18 months before the check stopped, and I didn't have the energy or the money to chase him through family court for long. I had a daughter to raise, so I raised her. I packed her lunches every morning for 13 years. I drove her to figure skating at 5:45 in the morning every Tuesday and Thursday because she loved it, and I was not going to be the one who took that from her. I sat in cold arenas reading case files on my lunch break so I could leave work early on the day she had recitals. I took a second job 3 evenings a week at a call center when she was in middle school because I wanted her to go to university without debt, and I had done the math. And the math was not kind. She did go to university. Dalhousie. She studied nursing, which I thought was perfect for her. Miriam has always had this particular quality of paying attention to people, really paying attention in a way that made you feel seen. She graduated in 2013. I drove to Halifax for the ceremony, and I cried the entire drive home. Good crying, the kind that empties something out of you that needed to go. She met him the following year. His name was Adrian, and the first time she brought him home for Thanksgiving, I thought he was lovely. Polite, funny, in a quiet way, asked me about my work without glazing over when I answered. He was from Ontario, somewhere near Barrie, and he was doing a master's degree in environmental studies at UNB. I liked him immediately. I want to be honest about that. It was their second Christmas together when she told me who his father was. We were doing dishes after dinner, just the two of us, and she said it so casually that I had to ask her to repeat herself. Dad's company, I said. Which dad? Adrian's, she said. His father owns Northgate, the contracting company. I set down the pot I was drying. Northgate Construction, I knew that name. I had known that name for 22 years. In 1994, there was an accident at a municipal infrastructure project outside of Moncton. 3 workers were killed when a trench collapsed. Inadequate shoring, ignored safety protocols, a site supervisor who had flagged the conditions twice in writing and been told to stay quiet. The company responsible was Northgate Construction, owned by a man named Gerald Sutherland. I knew one of those workers. His name was Paul. He had been my neighbor for 6 years, and his wife Sandra was the woman who watched Miriam when she was sick and I couldn't miss work. He was 31 years old. He had 2 kids of his own. The investigation went nowhere. Northgate paid a fine that even in 1994 dollars was an insult. Gerald Sutherland never faced criminal charges. He expanded his company in the following decade, won provincial government contracts, became the kind of man whose name gets on donor walls at hospitals and university buildings. I had followed every development of that case for years. Not obsessively. I had a daughter to raise. I didn't have the luxury of obsession, but I had kept a folder. Old newspaper clippings, printed copies of the coroner's report summary that was released publicly, some documents I had come across through my work that were technically public record but that nobody had ever bothered to compile. I had kept it because Paul deserved to have someone remember, and now his killer's son was in love with my daughter. I didn't tell her. That's the part I've had to make peace with, and I won't pretend it was the right decision, because I'm honestly still not sure it was. I told myself it wasn't Gerald she was with, it was Adrian, that Adrian might not even know the full story of what his father had done, that I would look into it more before I said anything, and that maybe there was nothing to find, and I would be the woman who blew up her daughter's happiness over a 20-year-old tragedy in a folder full of old newspaper clippings. I kept quiet. I watched them together. I watched Adrian treat my daughter with kindness and patience, and I watched her become happier than I had seen her in years, and I kept the folder. The engagement happened in the spring of 2018. Miriam called me from a restaurant in Toronto. They had moved there together the previous year, and she was crying the good kind of crying, and I was crying too, and I said all the right things. Then I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time. I called Sandra, Paul's wife. She was living in Riverview by then, had remarried, had a decent life. I hadn't spoken to her in almost 10 years. I told her what was happening. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Elspeth, what do you want to do?" I said I didn't know yet. She said, "Whatever you decide, I think you should know that his company just won a federal contract, $42 million. They're building flood infrastructure in 3 provinces. I thought about that for a long time. The wedding was planned for September 2019 at a hotel in Toronto, one of those renovated old properties near the waterfront, the kind of place with original oak beams and a catering menu that lists the name of the farm where the beef was raised. I was invited to the rehearsal dinner. I met Gerald Sutherland for the first time across a table set with linen napkins and tapered candles. He was in his late 60s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of tan you get from actual leisure rather than yard work. He shook my hand and said it was wonderful to finally meet Miriam's mother, and he said it the way you say something you've rehearsed, smoothly, without letting it touch his face. His wife was warm enough. A woman named Beverly, small and careful, who laughed at the right moments and kept refilling everyone's water glass without being asked. Gerald's business partner was there too, a man named Clive, who talked about a hunting property they shared in northern Ontario for most of the meal. I watched Gerald carefully that evening. He was good at taking up space, good at making everyone in the room feel like they'd been chosen to be there. He did not ask me a single question all evening. The months before the wedding were the months I stopped sleeping properly. I had gone back through my folder. I had also, carefully, on my own time, using public databases, pulled up everything I could find about Northgate's current operations. The federal contract Sandra had mentioned was real. There was also a formal complaint filed by a worker safety inspector in Manitoba related to a Northgate project the previous year. The complaint had been dismissed. There was a quote from Gerald in a trade publication about his company's culture of accountability. I had also found something I hadn't expected. The original site supervisor, the man who had flagged the conditions at the 1994 collapse, the man who had been told to stay quiet. His name was Dennis, and he was still alive. He was 74 and living in Shediac. I found him through a community Facebook group for former residents of the Moncton area. I drove to Shediac on a Saturday in February. Dennis and I sat at his kitchen table for 3 hours. He told me everything. He had never told anyone officially because back then, a laborer with no union protection didn't testify against a company that could blacklist you across the province. He had watched the investigation go nowhere with a specific kind of grief that I recognized, the grief of someone who knows the truth and has nowhere to put it. He had kept his own records, warning reports he'd written and handed to the site manager, a photograph of the inadequate shoring he'd taken on a disposable camera because something felt wrong, a memo, handwritten, from Gerald Sutherland's office telling the site manager the timeline couldn't slip and costs needed to stay on track. He gave me copies of everything. I drove home in the dark, and I thought about Paul, and I thought about his 2 children who were now in their 30s with their own lives, and I thought about my daughter's wedding dress hanging in her spare room in Toronto. I didn't sleep that night either. I told Miriam 3 weeks before the wedding. I sat her down over a video call. I wanted to see her face, even through a screen, and I told her everything. The accident, Paul. The folder I had kept. Dennis. What I had found. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "Does Adrian know?" I said I didn't know. She said, "I need to talk to him." I said, "I know." She hung up and didn't call me back for 6 days. When she did call, she was calm in the way that people are calm when they've done their crying in private. She told me that she had talked to Adrian, that he had known there had been an accident. It had been mentioned vaguely years ago, but he didn't know the details, hadn't known his father had received written warnings beforehand, hadn't known about the memo. She said Adrian was devastated. She said the wedding was still happening. She said, "Mom, I love you, but I need you to let me handle this." I said I would. What I didn't say was that I had already made arrangements. The September day of the wedding was cooler than anyone had hoped for. One of those sharp Ontario September mornings that remind you summer is a loan, not a gift. I wore a deep green dress I had bought specifically for the occasion. Not mother of the bride lavender, not retiring beige. Green because I felt like being seen. The ceremony was beautiful. Miriam was radiant in a way that made my chest ache. Adrian cried when he saw her, which I noted. The reception moved into the ballroom. 140 tables, 280 guests, a band from Montreal that played during dinner. I was seated near the back, not at the family table. The seating arrangement had placed me 3 tables from the front beside Adrian's cousin and her husband, who were perfectly pleasant and had no idea who I was. Gerald Sutherland was at the front table with Beverly, with Miriam and Adrian, with Adrian's brother and his wife. The family table. I watched the entrees arrive. I watched the speeches begin. Adrian's best man, funny and a little nervous. Beverly, tearful and genuine. The maid of honor, who had known Miriam since university and made the room laugh twice. Then Gerald stood up. He had the microphone and the particular ease of a man who has never doubted his right to hold one. He talked about Adrian's childhood, about teaching him to fish, about being proud of the man he'd become. He talked about Miriam, gracious, complimentary, the expected things. And then he paused, the way practice speakers pause. He said he wanted to say a few words about family, about what it means to come from something solid. He talked about building things that last, roads, bridges, relationships. He said a good family is like good construction. It starts with the right foundation. He glanced in my direction then, just briefly. Maybe it wasn't even intentional. But then he said, and the microphone carried it clearly to every corner of that room, that he hoped Miriam would find in their family everything she perhaps hadn't had growing up. A real foundation, he said. 2 parents, stability, roots. The table nearest me went very quiet. I put down my fork. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think people expect rage, and rage was part of it. But the larger part was something colder and more certain. It was the feeling of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and who can finally see the place to set it down. I stood up. The room noticed. Rooms always notice when a woman of a certain age stands up at a wedding reception with a particular expression on her face. I didn't have a microphone. I didn't need one. I said, "I'd like to add something, if you don't mind." Gerald's smile stayed on his face the way smiles do when they're not sure yet whether to leave. I said, "I raised Miriam alone because her father left." "That's true, but I want to tell you what that foundation looked like. It looked like skating practice at 5:45 in the morning. It looked like working a second job at a call center 3 nights a week. It looked like driving 8 hours to Halifax for a graduation and crying the whole way home because I was so proud I didn't know what to do with it." The room was very still. I said, "But I also want to talk about foundations, about what we build and what we're responsible for." I reached into my bag and took out a folder. Not thick, just a few pages, clipped neatly together. I had carried it in my good bag since that morning. In 1994, a company called Northgate Construction was responsible for a trench collapse outside Moncton. 3 workers died. Written safety warnings had been ignored. A memo had been sent from the owner's office pushing timeline over safety. I set the folder on the table in front of me. That company was yours, Gerald. The color left his face in a way that I found, after all this time, strangely peaceful to watch. I said, Paul Arsenault was 31 years old. He had 2 children and a wife who watched my daughter when she was sick so that I could go to work. He deserved better than a fine in a company that kept growing. I looked at the room, not at Gerald. I'm not here to ruin anyone's wedding. Miriam and Adrian have my whole heart. I'm here because Paul's wife is still alive and his children are still alive. And this man has been getting awards and government contracts for 20 years, and someone should have said his name out loud in a room full of people a long time ago. I sat down. The silence lasted about 4 seconds, which feels much longer when you're inside it. Then Adrian stood up. He walked to the microphone. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. He said, "My wife and I have been talking about this for 3 weeks. We've made a decision together." He looked at his father. "We've retained a lawyer. The documents my mother-in-law has, plus additional records we've found, are going to a journalist at the Globe and Mail on Monday. We're not asking you to do anything tonight, Dad, but we're done staying quiet." He sat down. Beverly Sutherland put her hand over her mouth. Gerald did not move. I watched him do the particular calculation that men like him do when they realize the room has shifted, when the thing they've controlled for decades has slipped out of their hands in a ballroom in front of 280 people. The band started playing 20 minutes later. People came to my table, people I didn't know, and touched my shoulder, pressed my hand. 2 women around my age hugged me without saying anything. A man who turned out to be a former city councilor from Moncton asked me quietly if I had more copies of those documents. I said I had sent digital copies to 3 different people before I left my hotel room that morning. He nodded like he understood. Miriam came to me just before the first dance. She put her arms around me and didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "I'm sorry I didn't call you back for 6 days. I said, "I know." She said, "I was scared." I said, "I know that too." She pulled back and looked at me, and she had her father's eyes and my cheekbones and something that was entirely her own. And she said, "Were you scared?" I thought about it honestly. "No," I said, "I was ready." The article ran in November. Gerald Sutherland resigned from the board of his own company in December, the same week the federal contract was suspended pending review. Dennis gave a formal statement, his first to a journalist and a lawyer, both of whom treated him with the dignity he had deserved for 30 years. Paul's daughter reached out to me through Facebook. She was 34, living in Dieppe, working as an early childhood educator. She had seen the article. She said her mother had told her about me, that I was the neighbor who had kept the clippings. She asked if we could talk sometime. I said, "Of course. We speak on the phone every few weeks now." She has a little boy who just turned 2. She sent me a photo at Christmas. "He's got Paul's eyebrows," she said. I looked at that photo for a long time. Miriam and Adrian are in Vancouver now. He does environmental consulting. She's working at a hospital there. They came back for Easter, and we cooked too much food and watched a movie and fell asleep on my couch before 10 o'clock, and it was the most ordinary evening I've had in years. Ordinary like something solid. Something that was built carefully over a long time from the right materials. That kind of foundation. People ask me sometimes if I regret waiting so long. 22 years of carrying that folder. 22 years of knowing what I knew and saying nothing in any room that counted. I don't have a clean answer. I think I waited because I was tired, and then I waited because I was raising a daughter, and then I waited because I wasn't sure the truth was mine to detonate. That's the honest version. Not noble, just honest. But here's what I've come to understand about the way things actually work. Not in stories, not in the way we wish life operated, but in the real, grinding, unglamorous way of it. Actions don't disappear. They don't get filed away and forgotten just because nobody is looking. They accumulate. Gerald built a career on a foundation that had 3 men buried in it. And for decades, that foundation held because nobody with the right pieces was standing in the right place at the right time. But the pieces were always out there. Dennis kept his photographs in a shoebox for 30 years. I kept my clippings in a manila folder. Paul's daughter grew up and became a person who deserved to know why her father didn't come home. The truth doesn't expire. That's what I kept coming back to in those sleepless nights before the wedding. It just waits. What I want people to take from my story, if they take anything, is something about what it costs to stay quiet versus what it costs to speak. I stayed quiet for reasons I understood, but I also want to be clear. Staying quiet is a choice, and choices have weight. Every year, Gerald Sutherland won a new contract, gave a speech at a charity dinner, had his photograph taken shaking someone's hand. That was partly possible because the people who knew what he had done decided the cost of speaking was too high. I was one of those people for a long time. I'm not proud of it. What changed me wasn't anger. I want to be clear about that too, because I think people expect the revenge story to be fueled by rage, and mine wasn't. What changed me was sitting across a kitchen table from a 74-year-old man in Shediac who had spent 30 years carrying a guilt that was never his to carry. Dennis flagged the danger. Dennis wrote it down. Dennis handed it to the people who were supposed to act on it. And then he spent the rest of his working life being quietly blacklisted and wondering if he could have done more. That's not justice. That's a system protecting itself. I think about Miriam too, the 6 days she didn't call me back. I understand them better now than I did then. She was trying to hold two things at once, the man she loved and the truth about where he came from. That's not weakness. That's what real moral intelligence looks like. It doesn't arrive instantly. It costs something. She and Adrian made their decision together, and they made it carefully, and they are living with it. That takes more courage than I think people credit them for. 30 years of skating practices and double shifts and an empty passenger seat on every school trip, that was my life. And I don't say it for sympathy. I say it because I want people to understand that the thing Gerald called a missing foundation was actually the whole story. It just didn't look like what he expected a foundation to look like. It didn't have his name on it anywhere. It was made of smaller things, steadiness and showing up and keeping the receipts. Keep the receipts. In the end, that's what I'd tell anyone.